And we are live. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. Shalini Kantayya is an American filmmaker and environmental activist whose films explore human rights. The film under consideration tonight, Coded Bias, premiered at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim and won a CIMA Award for Best Director, and has been nominated for a Critics' Choice, a Cinema Eye Honors, and the NAACP Image Award, among others. Shalini's debut feature, Catching the Sun, premiered at the LA Film Festival and was named a New York Times Critics' Pick. Catching the Sun released globally on Netflix on Earth Day 2016 with executive producer Leonardo DiCaprio and was nominated for the Environmental Media Association Award for Best Documentary. She directed the season finale of the National Geographic television series Breakthrough, executive produced by Ron Howard, broadcast globally in June 2017. She's also directed for Nova and YouTube Originals. Shalini is a TED Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, and an associate of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. She has also founded the production company Seventh Empire Media, with the mission to create a culture of human rights and a sustainable planet through imaginative media that makes a real impact. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Ruha Benjamin. She is a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, and author of the award-winning book, Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, among many other publications. Her work investigates the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology with a focus on the relationship between innovation and inequity, health and justice, knowledge and power. Ruha earned a BA in Sociology and Anthropology from Spelman College, MA and PhD in Sociology from UC Berkeley, and completed postdoctoral fellowships at UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics and Harvard's Science, Technology, and Society program. She's the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including from the American Council of Learned Science Societies, National Science Foundation, Marguerite Casey Foundation 2020 Freedom Scholar Award, and the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton. And last but not least, Chris Gilliard has a PhD from Purdue University's Rhetoric and Composition program and currently teaches at Macomb Community College. His early work focused on the ways that narratives about Black athletes constructed Blackness along a narrow and limiting spectrum. He shifted that focus a bit, and for the last several years, his scholarship has concentrated on privacy, institutional tech policy, digital redlining, and the reinventions of discriminatory practices through data mining and algorithmic decision-making, especially as these apply to college students. He's currently developing a project that looks at how popular misunderstandings of mathematical concepts create the illusions of fairness and objectivity in student analytics, predictive policing, and hiring practices. He speaks widely, and his critical perspectives have had a profound influence on conversations about technology and education today. He is the recipient of the Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center Visiting Research Fellow. He's a member of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry Scholars Council, and he serves on the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project Advisory Board. So, if I have any breath left at all, that is a lot of credentials packed into one night. So I really appreciate everybody being here. And I would actually like to go ahead and get started with questions if that's all good for everybody. My first question actually is for Shalini. And is Shalini okay?
It's Shalini. It's actually Shalini.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. Oh,
That's okay. My mom gave me a hard time in life. It's okay. Everyone gets
I'm so sorry. Okay, so Shalini, that's great. I actually, as a person who loves film, I wanted to actually start out kind of asking about the establishing shot, where Joy Buolamwini walks into the MIT Media Lab. There's a slow pan that goes up from the stairs and pillars of the frieze marked with the William Barton Rogers name. And there seems to be a lot at stake in that opening shot. Mm-hmm. And when you started this film, what did you expect to discover or reveal, and why was that sort of what you thought of for your opening shot?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for this esteemed panel. It's such an honor to be on this panel, especially with Dr. Ruha Benjamin. I feel like I shouldn't say anything at all um, for the next hour. I'm really honored to be here. Um, I often think about who I am representing and whose voices I'm amplifying. And if you notice in the film, I sort of shoot my experts, who happen to be all women of color, on very sort of formalistic backgrounds. And I make sure that I actually list their credentials and their PhDs next to their names, because I find that women of color need to be elevated a little bit. We need that extra lift so that people know that you're speaking to someone of credential. And I think in that opening scene, Joy can come across quite disarming. She's sort of this young graduate student who stumbles on this discovery. And I think it was very important to me to sort of establish the halls of MIT, the place that she's walking in as an institution, and sort of these sort of formalized elements of establishing her as a woman of color in this space, in this institution that has so much nostalgia and mythic quality around. And so that's sort of why I chose sort of very formal elements to establish MIT and her coming into that space.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm wondering. So I know a lot of documentary makers. They start their subject and they move along with it and kind of find out what story it tells. Did you expect for this to go where it went?
No, I think that my films are as much a journey to me as they are the viewer, and I don't always know how I'm going to get my way out. I feel like I wander my way into my films just by my curiosity. And in this type of scenario, I sort of fell down the rabbit hole. I didn't even know what an algorithm was 3 years ago. And I literally couldn't talk to people for 2 years because I'm not credentialed in this space, and came at it quite as an outsider and had to navigate my way through. And so I feel like I go through this very rigorous process of listening. And when I'm listening, I almost can't speak. And so I often joke that at parties, I couldn't talk to anyone. People would ask me what I was working on. I'd sort of scratch my head and say, I'm making a film about racist robots. And I'd watch their eyes glaze over. And I just couldn't explain it. And it took me a long time to articulate. And I think in some ways it would have been much easier to make a film just about facial recognition because it's so invasive and intimate and personal and part of ourselves. But I was as awed and as shocked and as terrified as any audience member as I sat with this sort of brilliant and brave cast in my film, who really, I'm so grateful to them for schooling me and giving me an education that I could then communicate in a film. And then there's the process of actually telling a story. And that is an incredible craft. In documentary, I call it the dark night of the soul. It's when your film is not working and you're trying to make sense of all of the parts of a movie. And in a documentary, that can be years of your life. And in this case, it was so complicated. I don't have any advanced degrees, unlike this panel in this work. And I had to also get over my own imposter syndrome of feeling like I was so terrified that I would use algorithms or machine learning or AI sort of incorrectly, and people would laugh at me and my research would be discredited and my voice would be discredited. And I think that in the making of this film, I realized that having those feelings of being an imposter is exactly the reason that someone like me needs to sit at the table, and that we all have something to share. And sometimes the places in ourselves that make us vulnerable are exactly the reason that we need to be at tables where we don't quite fit or haven't exactly been invited to the conversation. And so I think I went on a journey to make this film, and feel very grateful to have found my way out.
That's great. That's really great. Yeah, one of the things that I really loved about the film was how accessible it makes something that's a very difficult subject. There have been a couple of other films that have come out the last year or so to talk about algorithms and that kind of thing, but they have felt, Ruha's sort of nodding like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. And they've been really contrived. I'm not going to name them, but they've been really contrived. And they tend to promote the people who did this. And so I found the film really refreshing in that way, because it was very frank talk, but it was also really accessible for people who, I mean, I don't know a lot about it, and I know a lot more now. So I really appreciate that. So I have another question, and I'm going to direct this one actually to Dr. Benjamin.
You can call me Ruha too, please,
Okay,
since we're all going first names. Yeah.
Okay, I'll call you Ruha. That's good. So Joy Bulamwani, when notes at some point in the film, she notes that data is destiny, and that data is a reflection of our history, and the past dwells within our algorithms. I was really intrigued by that concept, and the work that you've done, work included in your book, Grace After Technology. Have you also found that data is a reflection of history? And I'm curious what you would say about whether data is destiny.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the main reasons why, in trying to find a language to describe this set of issues, I landed on the new Jim Code, because I wanted to evoke a sense of history in naming the problem. I wanted that sense to complicate the idea that technological innovation is the same thing as social progress. We can have lots of new technologies that hold us still or take us back. And so I really wanted my language around this to be haunted by the past, and specifically past regimes of racial domination, so that we can't escape it in our naming of it. But I just wanted to say to Shalini's just her what she reflected on, and your question, Sean. First of all, I also geek out when I get to hear artists, filmmakers talk about what happened behind the scenes, like how they came, like any glimpse of like behind the, backstage. I'm like, that's like the best experience for me. So just listening to you just talk about that journey, really, I think the craft of storytelling, like there's been so many peer-reviewed articles, there's been so much ink spilled on this, and I really do believe that the contribution of coded bias to not only the debate, but shifting the popular consciousness around this is going to be profound. And it really can't, it can't come, I mean, all of the piled high scholarship, I mean, I know that you drew on it, but I just want to say how much I respect and honor the craft that went into putting the stories together. And I know it wasn't easy, and you didn't know where you were going to end up. And so I just want to thank you for your contribution to this work. And also, I completely agree with you that the stakes are too high to allow the people that have the technical expertise to guide the conversation and to guide the way forward. Like that's part of the problem, is that the space is monopolized by those who have a kind of hubris around understanding, or at least pretending like they understand, which, as we dig into this, we know that a lot of things they can't explain in terms of how machine learning and AI works, but at least have that kind of air of expertise. And I think it's precisely those who have been excluded, pushed out, made to feel dumb, like all of the things that makes it imperative that we completely blow up that table and really think anew. And so I just want to say that it was you who was supposed to do this.
That's fantastic. I'm actually curious, and I don't know, this is just a question that pops into my head over and over again, actually, the more that I find out about algorithms and the way they work. Why doesn't anybody know how they work? Does anybody know why we don't know why they work? Like, I don't understand that. That's so complicated to me that we would invent something that then we don't understand how now it's controlling our lives.
And the people who invented it don't even understand it either. That's the crazy part. I mean, I think, I worked on, you noted I did work on climate change before this. I have never seen power like this, consolidated power like this in my life. And I think when it comes to artificial intelligence, it's a little by design that all of the knowledge has been in the hands of the few. So all of the power has been in the hands of the few. And I feel so grateful to the brilliant and brave cast of my film for giving me an education and helping me to discern science from pseudoscience, from science from what is bogus baloney, technologies that are predatory on our communities. And I think that one of the issues is actually that if a 5-year-old, these days, a 10-year-old is going to start using a phone in the 5th grade, that seems to be the age that we should start learning about algorithms and data collection and what's happening. And I think that even for me, it's often talked about in terms of privacy, and that's not a word that I identify with at all. And in the making of this film, I really have come to realize that the more accurate term is invasive surveillance. And I think that, I hope that Coded Bias sort of pulls out a chair for us and offers us a place all at the table, because these systems impact all of us. And I don't know why. I mean, I feel like it's something that should be taught. And I'm always surprised, even when I'm interacting with college students, how few of them understand that Google is an advertising platform, or that it's not actually knowledge or what's happening. And I feel like I was on a panel with Kathy O'Neill, and she said, it's data science, so we should treat it like science. We shouldn't treat it like a faith-based religion. And I think that Meredith Broussard talks about techno-chauvinism and this idea that we have this sort of ethos, this like big magic around technology solving all of our problems without fully understanding how these systems work.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And it's, I mean, one thing I really like about the film too is again, it's very even-handed, a way that it deals with this information. It's not hyper alarmist. It's not, it's very, very even-handed about the way that it handles all of this. And I feel like that's actually the beginning of illiteracy, a way for us to talk about this and a way for us to learn about this. So I agree with you. I think this needs to be taught as soon as someone can pick up a phone. They should be learning how digital literacies essentially, and how this all works. I want to bring in Chris Gilliard too here, and ask a question real quickly about sort of considering your work on digital redlining and surveillance. This question actually comes directly out of the film. It was a question that was asked in the film. What does it mean to live in a society where AI is increasingly determining what liberties we may have? And what does it mean when that society is one where people are discriminated against? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, but I do want to go back to your other question, your previous question. So I'm going to give a very simplified definition. So apologies to any computer scientists or data scientists out there, right? But so there's a story about coders trying to teach a system how to recognize the difference between a dog and a wolf. Okay, and so one of the things, like the basic way that a lot of these systems work is just by processing massive amounts of data, data sets, images, you know, what have you, and determining patterns. And so the reason people often don't know how it works is there's no accounting for how the what patterns the machine is going to learn or distill, right? And so they thought they had figured out that they thought the system had figured out how to tell the difference between a dog and a wolf, but what the machine was actually looking at was snow in the picture. So that, right, like that is the thing that identified to the machine that it was a wolf and not a dog. And so again, like, so the how we get here, right, is that we have systems now that have like massive computing power that can look at you know, massive amounts of data, right? That's we used to call it big data not that long ago, and derive patterns from that and make predictions. But often there's no accounting for like what exactly, like how that pattern was understood by the machine. And so that's where we get results that often people don't understand, or people know sort of what, perhaps what the input was, and perhaps what the output is, but not the middle part, which, you know, like often gets kind of understood as a black box. So yeah, okay, and I'm sure like if any computer scientist is listening, they're screaming their head off right now. But it's kind of it's a definition I think that works well enough to I'm sorry, I have a puppy. So to your other question, I thought that this was really important in the film, that we already do live in that system. That, you know, when we talk about you know, China's social credit system, I mean, we have Equifax and Experian, right? Like that we're already kind of deep down the rabbit hole where sort of opaque systems make all kinds of decisions about, you know, who we date, where we can live, where we get into school, like all these things that are mentioned in the film. And so that I think is a really important thing as we talk about these things and as more people kind of learn about these systems, is that like we're kind of already there. And so learning about them is also gonna like necessitate learning about how to like crawl out and claw our way out of this. Yeah, sorry, that's it.
No, I think that's right. I think, and I think the film wants us to ask that question. I mean, I think that automatically comes up as like, well, how do we claw our way out of this? As you said, I think that's actually really important. I'd be curious, actually, from anybody on the panel. I've been having conversations recently with students and about algorithms, and some of them are watching tonight. Hi, everybody. I'm curious, what do you say to somebody who says, oh, their algorithm is really good? Like, if, you know, if someone says, oh yeah, I love TikTok, the algorithm is really, really good. How do you begin to explain to somebody that maybe good isn't the right word?
I'll jump in. I mean, I want to say, I mean, this builds off a lot of Ruha's work, but I often think it's useful, and this might seem hyperbolic, but it's often useful, I think, to think about a lot of this stuff as carceral technologies, in that a driving force in a lot of these things is to sort of capture and is to capture people in ways by extracting their data and making predictions about them, and that they are ultimately like, so even like a good algorithm, right, like a functioning algorithm is not necessarily that one that works in the best interest of the people. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. The people whom it's like capturing, and I think that that's like you know, like you could argue that the algorithm that invited insurrectionists to join groups on Facebook was a good algorithm. But I don't think it was a good algorithm for society.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great and recent example of something being working technically, being good at a technical level, and having social, political, economic fallouts, or in some cases intended results. And so I think there's a lot of ways you could parse that question and unpack it and engage in conversation. One is definitely what Chris mentioned in terms of distinguishing between something being good on the front end for a user in terms of making things more convenient or entertaining. So the pleasurable aspect makes it good, but that also means you spend more time on it. It's getting more data from you. It's selling you more things. And so distinguishing the front end goodness from all of the back end, behind the scenes, that aspect, and the way that that can exploit, discriminate, and do all the things. The other is also just to recognize and to have a conversation about an algorithm or a technology being good for some people and not for others, you know? So if something was designed for you, you experience it as convenient, as good in your life. And that's a kind of, you know, narrow view of sort of evaluating, having an evaluation of something, because we want to think about how it's affecting, especially those who are historically and continue to be harmed by our socio-technical system. So again, there's so many different ways to think about that idea of goodness. Mm-hmm.
So one of the other things that captured me really when I think about this, and so much, I mean, there were so many really amazing moments. I was literally watching this and making notes and screaming and laughing, and just it was incredible to watch. When we talk about algorithms sort of influencing what we know about the world, one of the things that for example, the example that Zeynep Tufekci offers around the 2016 election and Facebook, that essentially it was feeding us information, what we thought was information, and it changed the way that we looked at the world, even changed behavior. I'm curious about what the interaction is between, and maybe this is way too vague, but if there's anybody in this room who can, if there's anybody who can answer it, is this group here. What is the interaction between the self and the algorithm? Because digital identity is often set up by our posting on Facebook or our presence on Twitter. And we think we have a lot of control, and we put our profile picture up and we post on as we want to, but the algorithm's feeding off of that as well. And so how does that begin to influence our sense of self within our world, if this makes sense, within the world, but also within the internet, the digital, because I feel like there's an interaction that's going on, and it's more than just the algorithm surveilling us. It's actually like a conversation that's happening. We are also learning from the algorithm. Does that resonate?
Well, I'll jump in and use the example of China, because that seems to be, it's sort of like a Black Mirror episode inside of the documentary. And it's a scene where I think Western people of democracies kind of lose their mind when they see that film, that part of the film. And it's because I think there is part of us, you know, she's saying that I don't actually need to meet people. I can just rely on this social credit score, and it can save me a lot of time. And I think that moment in the film is really important, because I think we like to think of that as a galaxy far, far away, a sort of Orwellian 1984 kind of episode. But I really think it's something that's sort of right here. And I think that we all have part of ourselves that's like, wow, I could buy a candy bar with my face. How cool would that be? I could pay for dinner with my face, without sort of thinking about what we're losing in that race to efficiency. And I think people look at that moment where she's like, I don't need to meet people, and think, oh, wow, that's authoritarian state in China, without thinking, how many times have I judged someone based on how many Instagram followers that they have? How many times have I made a decision or felt like I should delete something because not enough people liked it? And I think that it talks about what Kathy O'Neill names so eloquently as algorithmic obedience training, the way in which our societies are being remade by algorithms. And I don't think we've actually begun to even grapple with what that silent hand, that nudge means. I mean, I grew up of a generation where the next song was chosen by the DJ, like the resident selector chose the next song. And I, even would go to curated spaces to look for films where I knew that there was a certain hand, there was a certain human curation that I could trust. And now you're getting this, would you like to listen to this next? Would you like to see this movie next? And that can easily turn into, do you want to vote for this candidate next? And I really worry about that space as someone who really cares about the free exchange of ideas and really benefits from people who think differently than me. I actually am very interested when I get to have a respectful conversation with someone who thinks really different than me. It's exciting. That's civic dialogue. It's I call it the sacred space of the independent cinema hall, when the lights go up and someone's upset about something you said in the film, and you have this like sort of respectful conversation. And hopefully you grow each a little bit from that conversation. And I think we're losing those spaces. And I think that we don't always understand what that silent nudge is doing. I was on a call with some people from the EU, and they were talking about how they translated Hungarian and it was a gender neutral language. And the AI started to pick up on things that it by itself started translating. She is doing the dishes, she is caring for the children, he is going to work, he is a doctor. And this is a completely gender neutral language, but the AI is sort of picking up on these similarities. One time I was at Sundance and I saw Ryan Coogler, the maker of Black Panther, on a panel, and I was going home insecure, and I Googled average age of accomplishment, and it gave me all men. And so I Googled average age of women's accomplishment, and it gave me the average age women lose their virginity. and these little nudges, these silent nudges, are limitations of our ideas, of our thoughts, of where we can go in culture, and the kinds of boundaries that we transcend. And I don't think we've really looked at what that silent hand is doing in our lives, and the way it's limiting our beliefs and our thoughts about not just who each other are, but who we are and who we can be.
Yeah, I totally, that resonates, the idea that we have yet to really take stock or reckon with the different shifts underway. And I would just add, and I love this image of the silent hand, because another part of this sort of puzzle has to do with so many of the technologies that we're talking about. One of the ways to think about them is that they allow us to outsource really consequential decisions. And so there's an element of the silent hand that is coercive and that's nudging us, but there's also a demand for a silent hand to be like, you decide, and as a way to kind of, to pretend like there is no human agency. And by that, I'm thinking about the human agency that has created the hand and the values and the kind of things behind the screen. And so, for example, all of the ranking, rating, predicting systems, they allow people to say, it's not me that's making this judgment about you. It's the system, it's the software. and specifically, I'm thinking because, we have, educators listening. I'm sure all of you have seen from the last 2 months, the student success predictor tool that is used in different schools, that essentially creates risk scores for college students to say, if you, if you come into my office, I'm your advisor, pull up your record, you might be, let's say, a Black woman in biology, high risk, because the algorithm has been trained to, take all this data from, et cetera. And so now as a guidance counselor, I can say, well, it's not that I think you can't handle it. It's the system that's saying that you're high risk, but if you change to this major, now you're low risk or medium risk. So again, this is a way of dissociating and not taking responsibility for the kinds of forms of discrimination that permeate all of our spaces. So that's another way to think about, in some contexts, the silent hand is unwanted, but in others, there's a demand for it, as a way to not be accountable.
Yeah, I think the one other thing I would add is, I think the sort of the myth of many of these platforms is that if they extract enough data about you, that they can give you what you want before you want it, so that they can, for the music example, right, you can play the song that you want, right, the next song that you wanted before, without you even telling it, right, can order food for you, can, do all these things. And I think it's an important but really flawed narrative that tech companies tell, because what they're actually doing is shaping desire, and I fundamentally disagree with the notion, right, that these systems are going to learn me so well that they can know what I want, but that if they can know me well enough to perhaps like nudge me in particular ways that are more to their benefit than my own.
I think the question of to whose benefit it is something that people aren't, they're not trained to ask that question. And so they're encountering technology and it looks like a convenience, and they're not recognizing that the technology is training them. I do want to go ahead and turn quickly to some of the audience questions that are coming up. And I'm sorry, I keep looking away because I'm looking at YouTube on this side over here. I want to make a really interesting note before we get to questions. Chris Gilliard has decided not to turn his camera on, which is completely awesome. And the whatever it is that's controlling the YouTube thing that is projecting this onto YouTube is not picking up his box at all. It's just the three faces. And so people on YouTube are like, who's talking? Because they don't see Chris Gilliard on the screen. And I think that's really fascinating. I don't know what's happening there. I don't understand what's going on there, but for some reason, yeah, everyone's hearing you, Chris, but no one can see your black box with your name on it. I just wanted to clarify that also, just for the people watching on YouTube. Like, Chris is here. He's just, you just can't see him.
Yeah, that's, I think, Zoom settings, so that if people were like, behind the scenes helping us with the panel, they could be in the space but wouldn't be projected. So we would have to change. We would have to do something about the settings.
That's so fascinating. Okay, cool.
What I thought you were going to say, Sean, is that it zoomed in on you when I wasn't talking. That was going to be a whole nother trip.
Oh, that would be an entirely different thing. Okay, so I do want to address a couple of the questions that have come up. One of them is I think a question I would like to sort of finish with. So even though it was asked first, I'm gonna save it for a second. But we have a question from Autumn Keynes. Can you talk a little bit about the perspective of women of color and why they seem to be the most impactful critics of this tech?
I just want to say that I think I've never had a discussion, and I probably had 400 discussions about the film, where they did not note that it was all women of color in the film. And I am totally fine with that. But the next time you see a technology film that centers the voices of white men, I hope they ask the same question, because I think that we see those films all the time and we don't bat an eyelash. And I didn't realize what a revolutionary act it would be to center the voices of women of color. And I didn't set out to sort of tell that story, to actually do that, to center the voices of women of color, although I am a filmmaker that thinks very conscientiously about whose voices I'm elevating and amplifying. But it was actually the research that kept taking me back to all of these incredibly brilliant women of color, and Ruha Benjamin was the one who got away and belongs in the film. But I think that is by design, because I think the film is actually representative and reflective of 20 years of journalists, artists, activists, data scientists, mathematicians, who have been on whose scholarship the film stands. And I think that is because not only are the women in the film hands down some of the smartest human beings I've ever spoken to in my life, advanced degrees in data science and mathematics, and Kathy O'Neill trying to teach me how she knitted the equation for pi into a sweater. Very astute in their fields, but they also had an identity that was marginalized. They were women, they were people of color, they were LGBTQ, they were religious minorities. And I think having an experience of not being centered gave them a perspective that allowed them to shine a light into the biases that Silicon Valley missed. And when you consider for a moment that only 14% of AI researchers are women, half the genius has been missing from the conversation. And it's really my hope that by centering these voices, that a new type of genius can be unleashed and a new type of imagination about how these systems can be used.
I love that reflection, Shalini, and I would just add, just to underscore this idea that when you have had to navigate whether a social system or a technical system that wasn't designed for you, you have a particular insight into its design. When things are working seamlessly, you don't have to think about things. But when it's not working, you have to actually think about it and make the design explicit, whether you're talking about a defunct educational system, healthcare system. And so now we're talking about computer systems. So although, in terms of the scholarly work around AI is maybe, 20 years old, when you think about this even longer tradition of women of color thought, of Black feminist intellectual traditions, then you get to see, oh, this is a much longer tradition in which people have had to develop genius and knowledge to navigate and to understand the underside of modernity. And so, I think about, Toni Cade Bambara writing that not all speed is movement, and how prescient that is when we think about technological speed and when we conflate technological sort of progress with social movement and social progress. And so I think about how that reverberates in the work of the amazing people whose voices we hear in the film, is essentially that chorus that not all speed is movement. Slow down, let's think about what we're building, why, and if we even need certain kinds of tools. And it's really that, that intellectual and movement tradition that I hear echoed throughout the film.
So I could do this the entire night, and I'm so grateful that you guys are here. But I do want to get to this question, which was actually the question that was the last question I was going to ask, but then someone else asked in the audience. So what's next? What can a teacher do in this case? What can a classroom K-12 teacher do in preparing, understanding, and fighting these issues. And I think that it's part of the thing when I was watching the movie too, was recognizing that all of these folks, all these amazing women who have all these, like all this insight and all this knowledge, we're still using this. And and so and they were, you know, they weren't walking around with masks on. I mean, of course now they would be, but they weren't wearing, you know, they weren't trying to defeat the facial recognition that was on the street. They were still using their phones. And so there's a question of like, well, what action do we take? What's appropriate? Because I know a lot of people would just become technophobes and like throw everything away and not want to do it anymore. Where's the balance? What sort of action is reasonable at this with all this knowledge?
You know, I just want to start by saying that I did not realize the extent to which AI, algorithms, machine learning is transforming everything I love. All of my values, whether it be access to fair and accurate information, fair elections, equal rights, fair housing, that some communities aren't over-policed and over-brutalized. Everything that I value in life is being transformed by AI. And to me, I think Joy Buolamwini frames it correctly when she talks about this being the undone work of the civil rights movement. And to me, when people ask me, how do we do this? I say, we do it the way that people did it before, which is we show up and we let our voices be heard. And I'm so grateful, I think, to all the people who came before me so that I could have a voice. And I really see this being the next frontier of the civil rights movement. And I think that we have to do all of the inventive things, whether it's like make art, make song, call legislators, stage sit-ins, have mass teach-ins and literacy projects. I feel all of those movements that led to the rights that we have today are exactly what's at stake when we're talking about algorithmic justice. And so I feel like a lot of those same ways forward are how we fight for this sort of new era of where our civil rights, where the battle of civil rights will be fought.
I mean, I think that the Brooklyn Towers episode in the film is so important and so instructive because those people did not start out as experts in this, and they became experts. And you know, I think that it's instructive for a lot of reasons. And one is that we're constantly told that these systems are too complex, except for, you know, such that only like a small segment of the population can understand. Okay, this is like blatantly false. But I mean, the other thing is that you know, like they banded together, became experts, and won. You know, there's a recent article from the last year in the Guardian about K through 12 students and their parents. So it was like these parents, the schools were kind of in the Virginia, DC area. So a lot of the parents were federal employees, you know, FBI, judges, politicians, things like that. They got together and told the school, right, and including like big companies like Google and things like that, that at the end of the year, they're going to have to delete all the data that they had accumulated on their students on their kids, because they didn't think that these companies should have, you know, accumulate a permanent record on their kids. And I thought, you know, I mean, on the one hand, we can think about that and say, see what power does, right? But I think it's possible that all of us could have the juice to do that, right? But we gotta like figure out how to do that, right? I think that the Brooklyn Towers example is instructive in that regard as well.
Yeah, and I totally co-sign what both Chris and Shalini have said, which is really that the framework going forward can't be a sort of consumer model, like being better consumers and making sure we get our, privacy contracts just right. And, like at the level of just being hyper vigilant as individuals. I think that that's an unreasonable expectation, and it's not a way to transform a social order that is being governed by these systems. And so the way forward is to strategize and think collectively, building on past traditions, whether and thinking on multiple fronts, like the problem is presenting itself through so many different pathways. So we have to think about, what do we need to change about the training and education of tech practitioners and everyone else? What do we need to do in terms of litigation and policy, in terms of organizing, both in terms of community organizing like Brooklyn, but also tech worker organizing? We've seen in the last year a real blossoming, whether it's of the Alphabet Workers Union gaining momentum in the last few months, but also the Amazon workers. Right now, they're counting the votes in Bessemer, Alabama. And these things are related. What we end up having to submit to as consumers, as individual device holders, is related. It's on a spectrum with how people are governed in these warehouses, algorithms telling them when they can pee, when they can shit, whether they can go home to their loved ones if they're sick, etc. And so we have to think on multiple fronts expansively, and to understand that the plight of the people who are packaging these goods to us is related to what we end up opening in our homes and undownloading in our devices. It's the same sort of cadre of people making the decisions at the consumer level and in terms of managing labor. And so for those listening, understand that the plight of what happens in Alabama, it affects all of us. It's not just a one-off sort of event, and it could and has the potential to really have a ripple effect. It would be the first union of Amazon workers in the US. There are in other countries. Again, thinking about going back to Chris's example, like the demand of one set of families in a certain region saying, no, we're not going to put up with that. Lets us know that it's possible to take a stand. Similarly, when we see unions in other countries that, or certain kinds of rights, tech, digital rights, that are being pushed in certain countries, it should not be simply something, oh, that's nice, it's happening over there. That means we can also push for that and demand that. And it has to, that momentum, I'm hoping will grow again, to think collectively, not simply what we need to do as consumers.
I just want to add one thing to that, which is that, I saw sea change in the making of coded bias that I never thought would be possible. If you told me in 2018 that the 3 biggest tech companies in the world would change their policy about selling facial recognition to law enforcement, I would have never believed you by their own volition. And I think what happened there was something that I think is a recipe for social change, which is that you had brave scientists like Joy Bellamwini, like Timnit Gebru, like Deborah Raji, unencumbered by corporate interest, putting their academic reputations on the line to challenge big tech power. And I've seen time and time again that these same researchers who seek to shine a light on bias in AI are dismissed and discredited and often attacked and fired, like Dr. Timnit Gebru was, before they are believed, before there's a mass movement behind them and they're believed. But we need those brave scientists that understand the science and can challenge that with the integrity of the scientific method. We need science communication on a massive scale around this stuff. It can't be just the big tech people that understand this stuff. The best feedback I've had about coded bias is that my grandmother loved it, or my 12-year-old loved it. And that's really why I made the film, because I want all of those people to know that we have a place at the table, because those same systems are deployed on all of us. They impact all of our rights. And so we need to understand them. And that power of literacy, I would not underestimate. And I've seen even the places that are most literate are usually the places where you see these movements happening locally. And then I think that it's really significant that that change happened in June 2020, when you had millions of people on the streets in the largest movement for civil rights and equality that we've seen in 50 years. And people were making the connections between racially biased invasive surveillance technology in the hands of law enforcement when no one we elected giving oversight, and the communities that can and will be most brutalized and impacted by these technologies. And I think that gave us this sea change that we never thought possible. We need brave science unencumbered by corporate interests. We need science, communication, and literacy on a massive scale. And we need engaged people of democracies all over the world who are taking action. And I think as much as coded bias is sort of dark and terrifying, it's really hopeful, I think. And I'm saying that as like a black turtleneck wearing New Yorker who's very pragmatic, that documentaries remind me that everyday people can really make a difference. And whether you're talking about the Brooklyn residents who not just kept their landlord from installing facial recognition in their housing complex, but they also inspired the first legislation in the state of New York that would protect other housing residents from the same invasive surveillance. And so to me, I think the biggest challenge is just believing that we're powerful and that we can make a difference. And I think that I've seen a small group of people coming together to make change and making it. And so I just want to say that I really believe that the cement is still wet, and that we have a moonshot moment to call for greater ethics and greater humanity in these technologies that will shape the future.
That's wonderful. That's fantastic. And that is actually where we're going to have to end because we are at time. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Shalini. Thank you so much, Ruha. Thank you so much, Chris, for being here and for contributing to this field, to contributing to people coming to understand what this all is about, and really developing these literacies that are so incredibly essential. So thank you so much again. And I hope we get to talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.